Hello, this is Julia Wahl in her podcast How to Live, and today I have the pleasure of being in conversation with Stan Steindl. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Stan. If not, then do correct me. And Stan is an Australian clinical psychologist with over 20 years experience as a therapist, trainer, and researcher. And you are also passionate about motivational interviewing and, of course, compassion-focused therapy. So, Stan, should we know anything else about you, about your recent projects? What did you get yourself into lately, so to speak?
Well, yeah. Hi, Julia. Yeah, no, that's beautifully pronounced. It sounds like you really nailed the Steindl. I often say Steindl, but I'm probably the one pronouncing it wrongly, to be honest. But yeah, no, delighted to be coming to you from Australia. I'm actually currently sitting in a place called Mooloolaba, which is on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. And no, that's about it. I work in private practice as a clinical psychologist. I really appreciate both motivational interviewing and compassion-focused therapy. They're certainly my two professional loves, if you like. I was saying to you just before we started, I'm a little bit preoccupied at the moment because I'm actually doing a TEDx talk in August, and so
Congratulations!
Yes, I guess so. It's both thrilling and terrifying because it's slightly out of my skill set, because you have to come up with a proper script, and then you're given feedback on your script, and then you have to, kind of sort of review the script, and they approve it, and then you have to memorize it. So it's an interesting process. So yeah, keep an eye out and see how that eventually goes. But yeah, so that's the only other fun little piece at the moment. So thanks for having me.
My absolute pleasure. And let us start, because we've already mentioned motivational interviewing and compassion-focused therapy. So why these two paradigms, Stan?
Yeah, well, it's sort of interesting to stop and think about that. I mean, one of the sort of the things that occurs to me is that, MI, motivational interviewing, really came first for me. So I was working away many years ago with combat veterans and people, who had post-traumatic stress disorder and problem drinking. Really was the comorbidity there that we were working on. And, of course, if you even sound a little bit like you're trying to tell them to stop drinking, they tend to give you a bit of resistance. And so we were trying to work out how can we approach those fellows in a way that really sort of engages them and piques their curiosity and starts to help them to come up with their own arguments for change. But, of course, all that was really grounded in a kind of a spirit of MI, which part of which is compassion. A lot of MI is based on Carl Rogers and that person-centered approach, but at the heart of it is this idea of compassion. So as I got more and more involved in MI and training MI and running workshops and so on, I started to kind of think, what is compassion, I guess, and not only what is it and so on, but how to train compassion for people who were perhaps, well, especially therapists, I guess, who were starting to learn about motivational interviewing. And so I followed my nose a little bit and eventually, some years ago now, came across Paul Gilbert and compassion-focused therapy, and felt very drawn to the evolutionary kind of underpinnings, I suppose, of CFT. It just made a lot of sense that actually, well, given our evolved brains, so much of what we might do and feel and think and so on is really not our fault, and that there's compassion. Compassion emerges from that sense that we have these tricky brains, and reflecting even on those veterans. I mean, we have tricky brains, and then when really difficult experiences happen, it sort of multiplies, and so became more interested in compassion, but compassion focused therapy, and kind of explored more and more of that. Had various trainings, and so now do a lot of. I present, I suppose, on the topic of compassion-focused therapy, and run workshops on that topic as well. And the thing that I like actually too about both MI and CFT is that they actually work very nicely alongside all sorts of other approaches. So you can bring MI to cognitive behavioral therapy, or you can bring MI to solution-focused therapy, and you can bring CFT to ACT, or whatever it might be. It's sort of it's compassion focused. So you can bring a compassion focus to all sorts of things that we might be doing, including outside of therapy, for that matter. Compassion focused. Yeah,
I would even argue that you can do CFT whilst you're doing psychodynamic therapy. So you're using different tools, but if you are referring to the concepts of CFT, you can do it by the means of Gestalt, psychodynamic therapy, and any other type of therapy. I don't know if
and I think. Yeah, I think the reason there too is because Paul Gilbert, who's a wonderful fellow, a genius, really. I know you've worked with him a lot and so on, and
we like you, Paul. So if you were listening, we like you and appreciate you. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul.
But what he's really achieved there is actually a very, very comprehensive and integrated model of the mind. And so that can be brought, to all sorts of things, including outside therapy, really. And dare I say it, compassion in business, or compassion in politics, or those sorts of things. Or even, there's a lot of work being done looking at CFT as it might apply to elite sports people, and so on. So, and motivational interviewing too. There's a lot of MI that one of the founders of MI, Steve Rolnick, he's doing these days quite a lot of work with elite sports people. Cricket is his massive passion, and so he brings MI to all of that. So I think that's what I really love about it as well. Is it's just really a couple of really wonderful models that can be brought to a whole lot of different different approaches and different work.
So since I'm asking been asking these questions to other people as well. So Paul, we mentioned Paul Gilbert, and Wendy Wood, and I'm interested in your answer to that question. So, what are the main misconceptions when it comes to compassion focused therapy? What do you think we misunderstand, or as maybe therapists who come from other fields, other schools, or what should be maybe made? We should make emphasize in terms of CFT.
Yeah,
because of that misunderstanding, for instance.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I feel like, darn, I wish I knew Paul and Wendy's responses to that question. But I'm actually going to answer this in a sort of I don't know whether I'm not sure whether it is a different way, but I think that one of the things that's very clever and wise about Paul's approach and CFT is that this notion of misconceptions or misinterpretations, or how people might sort of see the approach, is built in as part of the approach. And so what he's very cleverly come up with is the notion of fears, blocks, and resistances. And, fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion, to self-compassion, but also to various, kind of aspects of the approach, some of the exercises or experiential practices and that sort of thing. And so I often feel that, if we think about someone who might be kind of experiencing CFT as a client or consumer, that if they're expressing these concerns about it, or perhaps even misconceptions, then that's that's kind of cool, actually. That is often the work. We can explore that. We can listen to, what might be their perspective on compassion, or what compassion is. What are their reservations about that, or are there things that actually trigger off a bit of threat system for them? That they're just not sure. That makes them feel anxious, or that sort of thing. And I think the key there is really to honor that side, to sort of honor it, to listen, explore, validate, kind of accept, that side is very valid. And so, but that's the gift from Paul, I think, for us, is that that's how we can approach it. And we don't have to be concerned about misconceptions, but rather, kind of validate and accept them. And then also, kind of explore the other side. I mean, you can kind of sense probably this is my MI part of me coming out too. Like people feel ambivalent about things, and they feel ambivalent about CFT. And so if someone's coming along and hearing about this CFT thing, but they're a little bit reluctant, or they have these reservations, or they've got a bit of misconceptions here or there, we might accept and validate that, but we might also then kind of inquire about, what about the other side for you? Like, what do you feel are some of the good things about compassion, or this idea of self-compassion, or how we've talked about compassion-focused therapy? And quite often that'll be there too. There'll be intuitive wisdom, I think, for people about compassion and what it is. And probably it's similar with clinicians. I find that clinicians, sort of might come at it, but from their own perspectives of different approaches. And, like occasionally people might say, well, this sounds a little bit like narrative therapy, or, well, we already do this in schema-focused therapy, or, stuff like that. But again, I really kind of feel that, sort of you just trying to listen well, actually, and kind of explore that, and then gradually see if we can explore perhaps where there are some differences. There are some sort of sort of really qualitative differences, but there are some core differences I think in the model of CFT that I really appreciate and find helpful, and so kind of talking to clinicians about, or therapists about that, I think is pretty useful as well.
So what you're saying is that the misconceptions are actually they might be part of our psychoeducation.
Yes, absolutely. So we might. Well, I think the first thing is those misconceptions are, I think, an opportunity. They're an opportunity to have the conversation and to explore it. Psychoeducation might be part of Paul Gilbert does often feel that certain fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion are often partly driven by these misconceptions or these misinterpretations of things. And so psychoeducation can be really useful there. You just have to watch out, I think, though, because if you launch into sort of psychoeducation and you start to tell people these things, or even start to, sort of almost try to convince them out of their misconceptions, sometimes you run the risk of them doubling down and sort of becoming, sort of arguing against you and coming back with more logic about these misconceptions or whatever. And so it's often really great to sort of start with listening. There are some good ways, though, too, I think, to provide some of that CFT psychoeducation. I mean, we in motivational interviewing, we call it elicit, provide, elicit, where you elicit, first of all, what does the person already know about, evolutionary theory, or this idea of our evolved brains, and how anxiety works, or how the threat system works, or something like that. And so you can start by eliciting, asking what they already know, and then you might provide, but with permission sometimes is good. Just sort of saying, would you mind if I mention some of the CFT theory here and see what you think? And, usually they'll go, yeah, that's fine, you can do that, and then off you go, and then you can provide the psychoeducation, and then it's kind of elicit again. It's sort of asking, what do you make of that? How does that sit with what you already kind of knew, or are there any kind of ongoing thoughts or concerns that you might have? So it's still a conversation, I guess. It's not getting too much into the lecturing or the telling type psychoeducation, but rather this still evocative back and forth kind of conversation.
So conversational psychoeducation, that's how we could call it.
Yes, conversational, collaborative, exactly. Yeah.
So where is, according to you, Stan, where is CFT most useful? With whom? And what do we know so far based on our research and practice? So both.
I mean, I do feel that CFT is particularly useful when working with people around around both their self to other and their self to self relating. How is this person relating to others, and how might they be relating to themselves? Often, self-criticism, I think, is the key part of self to self relating that we're working with CFT. Well, I sometimes think, I think it was Chris Irons who said this to me. I'm not sure whether he coined the idea or not, but the unholy trinity, I think he said, was sort of self-criticism, worry, and rumination. And so those kind of self to self relating styles or thinking styles, I think, kind of CFT can work very well, because it's tone. I think inner voice tone is so important when it comes to, sort of how all of that might make us feel, like even if we are saying the right kind of things to ourselves, if we're saying it in a kind of a hostile or attacking or kind of critical tone, then we don't really feel any better from it, and that's really where Paul began. I think was sort of, how can we shift the tone? Initially, I think he would have referred to it as sort of, kind of trying to bring in a sort of caring tone, and then gradually, as his model developed, he sort of really identified this notion of a compassionate self. That we bring a compassionate tone and the wisdom and the strength and courage and the caring of compassion, and relate to ourselves in that way. I have some involvement with the University of Queensland here in Brisbane, Australia, and we have the Compassionate Mind Research Group with James Kirby. And we've done quite a few studies now looking at how CFT might be helpful with different populations, with varying life situations. For example, we've run some CFT groups with people who experience body related shame, body and weight related shame, and there seem to be very powerful effects there for that group in terms of reducing shame, reducing self-criticism and shame, increasing compassion and self-compassion. We've also done a similar sort of study with actually, this was an interesting one. This was with combat veterans, but it also included the veterans and their partners. And so they were couples that were coming along to CFT. And there was really something in that, I think, that the having the couples come along and work together and build a kind of a flow between them of compassion. Because as you know, compassion flows in three directions, being compassionate towards others, receiving compassion from others, and that self-compassion. And so when we were working with those partners and spouses, or those couples together, it seemed to be very helpful. And then another one too. This is Dr. Lisa McLean's PhD, and she looked at working with women who had experienced childhood sexual abuse, and were now kind of battling sort of the traumatic kind of effects of all of that. And actually, the CFT seemed to be very helpful, not only reducing shame, but also reducing some of those post-traumatic stress symptoms as well for those people. So yeah, the body and weight-related shame study that was really run by Dr. Alicia Carter. She was a PhD student on that, and who's now graduated and so on. And the veteran study was led by Dr. Madeline Rumenick. And so those papers are all out there. I can give you the links if you like. But yeah, very encouraging results, in terms of some of these, I guess, little RCTs that we've been doing here.
So you actually answered my next question. So concerning further applications of CFT, but maybe stopping there for a bit. So how do you see the future of CFT and what I call its next stages of development?
Yeah,
these further applications and.
Yeah, there's a few things, I think. I mean, the first thing is probably to do with building the evidence base, I suppose. It's sort of somewhat, well, it's sort of newer, I guess, than something like cognitive behavioral therapy and perhaps even acceptance and commitment therapy, both of which have many, many randomized controlled trials or other types of evidence to support them. And so I think that's a really important next step for CFT, is to really continue building upon some of that. It's hard work, that stuff, to kind of run those sorts of trials. But that would be very helpful. We're running another little trial at the moment, which is it's actually compassionate mind training, which is Chris Irons and Charlie Heriot-Maitland's program, and we're evaluating that with a university student sample. And so just to sort of see if that can help with all managing their stress, I guess, and so on that students are up against. So that's one thing. But the other couple of things I've been thinking about lately, one is cultural diversity. I think that's an interesting one for us to ponder. How is culture sort of related to compassion, or what compassion is, but also how might culture vary in terms of fears of compassion as well. We've done some studies with a Singapore sample, for example, and comparing a Singapore sample with an Australian sample, and with the idea that perhaps the Singapore sample is a more collectivist society, or the Australian sample is somewhat more individualistic. Yes, it was very, very interesting. There was some subtle but I think significant, really results there. Oddly enough, people from Singapore were higher on self-compassion than the Australian sample, and I know Chris Irons and his team have also explored a Sri Lankan sample that found similar results as well. We're in the middle actually of a study with kind of looking at South Asian samples, people mainly from India, I think really is kind of what we're targeting. That's a current honours student of mine, Annika Pandey, and I are sort of working on that at the moment. And I think that's important, because we need to make sure that we don't just assume that compassion is just this one thing and that it's the same everywhere or something like that. I mean, I'm probably there'll be fundamental bits that are the same, but I think it's very interesting to see what the differences might be as we kind of spread around the world.
I was just wondering, is it to do with our Western, whatever Western means, self-obsession, that actually it's because of a self-obsession that we do not have self-compassion, interestingly enough.
Yes.
Because if you're constantly worried about yourself, then actually you might end up not being very self-compassionate.
Yes, well, that's actually an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, in more individualistic societies, it might be that it therefore feels more
Mhm.
competitive, and
Mhm.
so we feel like we have to drive ourselves harder, or something
Mhm.
like that, as opposed to more collectivist cultures where perhaps there's this greater sense we're all in this
Mhm.
together, and so
Mhm.
it feels less competitive, less self-criticism. Therefore,
Mhm.
in this most recent study, and we haven't done this before, but the current study, we're actually measuring uh, sort of culture
Mhm.
using the HVIX, the horizontal and vertical,
Mhm.
individualistic and collectivist scale. So it's sort
Mhm.
of complicated sounding, but yeah, we're actually very curious to see whether a proper psychometric measurement
Mhm.
of that as a construct
Mhm.
then starts to predict some of these differences, quite apart from just,
Mhm.
I guess, where people live. So,
Mhm.
but no, I think that is very interesting.
Mhm.
I also think that neurodiversity is another one that's very
Mhm.
interesting to explore, but that's sort of still at a fairly early stage, at least in
Mhm.
a compassion focused therapy sense. We did a study last year looking at autistic traits and
Mhm.
how autistic traits might predict anxiety. And actually, that was an interesting finding. Autistic traits were related to anxiety and also related to self compassion, so that higher autistic traits
Mhm.
meant lower self compassion. But what we found was that the relationship between autistic traits and anxiety was mediated by self compassion, but
Mhm.
through emotion regulation,
Mhm.
which I thought was fascinating as well, because the idea there is kind of self compassion is a motivation.
Mhm.
But what was also key
Mhm.
was the actual skills
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
regulate those emotions, sort of the how, I guess,
Mhm.
of compassion or self compassion. But yeah, I think there's a lot more to do in that area as well in terms of future work.
So we're discussing CFT, but maybe looking at it in a broader way. So what needs to be changed, do you think, in terms of our way of thinking and actually doing therapy? Should we maybe rethink the whole therapeutic paradigm, Stan? Because I often feel and fear, I should say as well, that rather than psychotherapy providing us with more connection or connections plural, is actually disconnecting us from for instance, from the things that used to be so natural, like our communities. So these
Mm.
days we'd rather go to a specialist, to a therapist, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. At times, that's something we need to do, but that shouldn't be the only option. So maybe instead of going to a therapist, at times we should actually see our friends. So, what do you
Yeah.
think we need to change in terms of therapy?
Yeah. Yes, there's a wonderful researcher at the University of Queensland, Genevieve Dingle, who has done a lot of work looking at um, social connection
Mm,
through social activities. So, for
mm,
example, community choirs or
mm,
things like that, and social prescribing
mm,
actually as a
mm,
concept. That
mm,
an important way to be helpful for people. Perhaps people who might be suffering or
mm,
experiencing depression or other things like that. That social prescribing is a
mm,
really great way to go, to feel a part of something, a sense of belonging, a
mm,
connection and closeness to others, a kind of camaraderie,
mm,
and so on. So you're probably right. That actually we have lost touch a bit with that.
mm,
COVID and the pandemic smashed a lot of that,
mm,
for us. It
mm,
during that time, other people almost became the enemy, really, because we
mm,
didn't know,
mm,
are they
mm,
gonna, are they gonna
mm,
sort of cause us harm?
mm,
And we were told to stay home and
mm,
to, reduce the social contact and
mm,
wear masks, and we couldn't see
mm,
each other's faces. I mean, certainly in Australia, I think mostly, around the world, we're sort of largely through a lot of that. But I think it did leave its mark in terms of this sense of social connection and belonging. But I would argue that CFT really sort of privileges that part of it anyway. So if you think about, things like the 3 circles model, we've got the threat system, we've got the drive system, and we've got the soothing affiliative system. And the whole idea there, in a way, is this notion that we feel safe and we feel secure and we're able to kind of open up and explore and play when we feel close and connected with others, when we're part of the group. And so quite a lot of effort, I think, is actually placed on that, that it might be individual work, although I must say that group CFT is a particularly effective approach, I think, because it is then, everyone can be together in the group, sharing stories, offering compassion to and from each other, and really experiencing that. So group CFT is particularly helpful there. But individual CFT as well, there would be a bit of a focus on really trying to understand the person's soothing affiliative system, perhaps some of the challenges there, or how that part of themselves might be perhaps compromised a little bit even, and how to really develop the affiliations, the connections, both interpersonally but also intrapersonally, being able to create in our mind a sense of a compassionate other, for example, who we can sort of start to really explore developing a relationship with, and starting to feel more open to receiving compassion from others, and so on. So I feel like I think you're right. I mean, we don't want individual therapy to sort of be a kind of a replacement, I suppose, for other types of relationships and relating and that sort of thing. But I would say that my sense is that it gets brought into individual therapy. That's what we probably need to make sure we do. I was working with someone just this week who really was expressing. I mean, it was quite interesting because he's a particularly anxious person, and he has a big event coming up, which is a big family event. But he was feeling like he was sort of isolated from it all. But at the same time, he was very fearful of doing things that might help him to reconnect with family and so on. And I think this is what we can work with CFT is this double bind, where the thing that might help people to feel safe and to feel secure and to sort of be in affiliation with others is also the thing that is very scary and very threat system activating. And sometimes that's because of, all that's happened in their lives and the experiences they've had interpersonally or relationally or even in their attachment relationships. And so sometimes that's really the opportunity there, is to kind of work through that threat system that's somehow become associated with relationship, and then gradually help them to move towards others once again.
So what you're saying is that, and I actually agree with you, that CFT, I would call it paradoxical therapy, because it encourages us to maybe go outside of therapy and have that connection. But going back to therapy in the more general terms, maybe. So, do you think it should be changed in any way? The way that we currently are doing and understanding therapy, not only CFT. Yeah, I know it's not an easy question, Stan.
It's not an easy question, especially for someone who has based their life around the idea of being in one-on-one therapy with people. And actually, I have experienced it as well as on the client side, and a couple of times, and found it particularly helpful. So I suppose I might be something of an advocate of that sort of a process. The only thought that comes to mind, and we really are trying to do this in our practice, is the idea of being feedback informed, so that I think a lot of therapy, traditional therapy, is a little bit, behind closed doors, and the sort of the magic is happening back there somewhere, and but we never really get to see what anyone else does back there in the therapy room, and
Exactly, yes.
the client keeps coming, but what's actually happening? And so that probably is one thing that we've actually tried to implement more and more, is getting feedback session by session, looking at progress, plotting graphs of progress. I use an instrument called the depression, anxiety and stress scale 10 items. So two colleagues of ours here, Aaron Frost and Kim Halford, have developed a 10-item version of the DAS, which you can administer every session. And so, and then you sort of plot the results, and you can see, how is that person's psychological distress, going with therapy? Is this helping, basically? And if it's not helping or getting worse, then we need to do something. We need to change something. That becomes a discussion. It might be that we change something in the therapy we're doing, or it might be that the person tries a different therapist, or it might be that the person actually tries something other than therapy. But so I suppose that's one thing that I feel is becoming more and more important. The other thing I do, if I may say, given I'm often working with CFT, is I also administer my compassion, motivation, and action scale, because we have developed that scale, and it's a very brief scale. And so what one can do is track psychological distress, but also track self-compassion, motivation, and action. And the perfect result, of course, is that the person gradually becomes more self-compassionate, and therefore gradually becomes less distressed. And so then that starts to help us sort of feel like, okay, so this approach is actually being effective. So that's one thing that I think is interesting to ponder.
But I think that it's very important what you just said, because I think that therapists are often scared of evaluating their own work, and we know based on research that actually by evaluating what we do, we can enhance the therapeutic process. As simple as that. So it actually can be something very, very helpful. So Stan, if I may ask you a personal question. So, what does compassion and maybe even CFT? What's the meaning of it in your own life? How does it affect your own life?
I think I come from, funnily enough, a long line of doctors. Medical doctors. So my mum was a medical doctor. Her father was a medical doctor. My mum's mother was a medical doctor. I think my grandfather's father was a medical doctor. My grandmother's brothers were all doctors. I think her father might have been too. Anyway, there's a lot of them. And I didn't quite sort of make it to medical school. Actually, I don't know that I wanted to be honest. I wasn't really interested in the blood and bone side of things. I was very interested in being a therapist. But I do feel like, in a weird sort of way, compassion's kind of in the blood, I guess is what I'm saying. There's a real sense for me of having that just orbiting my life in a way for my whole life, and this notion of trying to be helpful. trying to be helpful to other people. When I was, sort of 18 or something, I was working at a kids helpline, a telephone line, counselling line for young people, and off it went from there. So I think it's sort of part of the blood. But I also learnt a lot about the three flows of compassion with my daughter, who has, she's kind of 21 and she's actually traveling the world at the moment. But when she was a baby, she had some really tricky medical conditions, and you really quickly learn that if compassion is only flowing out, then you're going to burn out. You're going to get exhausted and depleted, and so that was a sort of a kind of a very sort of a hard lesson around. You got to let compassion in, let other people be compassionate towards you, and also, I mean, self-compassion was the hard one, to be honest. Especially for someone who's a therapist and always concerned with helping others. And suddenly you have to kind of do things to help yourself or whatever, and so I know a lot of people struggle with self-compassion, but yeah, so those were, I think, very important kind of lessons, and became sort of meaningful, I think, in terms of really understanding the importance of the three flows and balance and that sort of thing. And now it has become something of a preoccupation in a weird sort of a way, I think. Like, I'm just very, very interested in it. I find it stimulating to think about. I feel that it really is important to see what we can do to promote compassion in the world. How to make a more compassionate world. I hate to mention it, but you get on Twitter these days and it's just horrible. The way things bounce back and forward there, and so I do feel, like it's sort of in my own modest way, like that's what I like to do, is to sort of spread the word and see if we can promote a more compassionate world.
So compassion is something that you live by.
Yeah, I definitely try to and put what I can into that. I mean, sometimes, like the other day, I was walking along the big veranda at work, and I noticed a woman who had a walker was sort of somewhat struggling to get into the women's bathroom there, and I sort of bounded over and I said, "Can I give you a hand?" And she was like, "Oh, no." So, I didn't quite nail that one. So it takes practice, it takes thought, and, sometimes you do it well, and sometimes it's sort of a bit trickier, but yeah, definitely try to live a compassionate life.
So any words of advice to newbies? So new therapists, beginners therapists, what they should know about therapy, maybe including CFT. What do you think would be important for a young Stan starting as a therapist?
Yeah. A young Stan. Oh, those were the days. I don't know about, I'm not sure where you are and sort of other places around the world. I think sometimes in therapist training, one of the things that gets a bit lost or gets a bit missed is just really listening well. I think that would be the thing that I would, kind of recommend to sort of young people if they were, or early career people if they were interested in what I might have to say. But yeah, listening well. I mean, there's a whole world, a rich world of kind of skill and practice there, I think, to really be able to help people feel heard and understood, to help people feel safe, to create the kind of therapeutic relationship that all the rest of these things then can happen within that therapeutic relationship. And we sometimes go a bit quickly to the content, to the psychoeducation or whatever it might be, and sometimes, well, slowing it down a little bit and listening well actually, kind of speeds it all up again, because with greater understanding comes greater helpfulness, and that's the thing. But no matter what approach you're using and so on, I'd be really trying to hone the really good open questions, the nice little affirmations, the kind of careful, reflective, active listening, and kind of really practicing that.
Well, slowing down I think, is very important. Personally, at times I feel obliged to speed things up because people are paying me. For instance, if I'm running a workshop, so they want to get to the main part, whatever that main part, the meat, whatever that means.
Yes.
But then I'm reminding myself, actually, as you were saying, it's not going to speed things up. Maybe only on the surface, But actually, if you want to understand it, and by understanding, I mean also feeling it, including feeling it in your body, you need to slow it down a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people will say, like, well, okay, just tell me what I need to do, to fix this or whatever, and then I'll say, okay, well, perhaps you could do, this and that. And they'll say, no, I don't want to do any of that. I just want you to tell me what I should do. Well, I think we need to slow it down, and let's just think about it and explore it and see what you've got to say, and listen well. Yeah.
So you've mentioned compassion and CFT also being used in other disciplines or other fields, such as, for instance, politics. So it's not only something we can do therapeutically. So do you have any examples of that, Stan? Or maybe you do research on that? So compassion and CFT being applied in other areas other than therapy.
Well, as you probably know, that Jennifer Nadel springs to mind. She runs Compassion in Politics in the UK, and is really kind of, doing some strong advocating, some fierce compassion around bringing compassion into politics. It's a very difficult one. For example, here we have a phenomenon, I suppose, whereby sometimes, sadly, people who might be refugees from other countries come here by boat. We're a very big island, I suppose. And it's tricky because one side of politics will say, we need to be compassionate. We need to sort of allow the boats to come in and sort of try to work towards integrating the people into our society. And then the other side will say, no, to be compassionate, we need to stop the boats. We need to turn the boats around because too many people are dying at sea. And it's tricky, I think, with all of that. I think many of us would have a view, probably one way or the other with that. But it takes a lot of wisdom to really work out exactly what is what is a compassionate way to respond to whatever the situation might be. I think the big thing for me in that sort of area is more to do with the way that we kind of treat each other too, trying to be less caught up in the sort of the threat-based drive where we're competitive and just sort of mean, across the aisle and whatever, and really starting to have more compassionate conversations with people who we disagree with. I really would love to see more of that in the world. But yeah, I mean, I do think that there's some really interesting applications, for example, of CFT in sport and self-compassion. There's a lot of self-criticism there, that people assuming self-criticism is going to motivate them and help them to achieve, and then worrying that self-compassion is going to make them lazy or self-indulgent. but actually the opposite is true. You know, self-compassion is associated with greater motivation
Mm.
for things that are important to us, and so on. So that's also been some interesting work.
I think it's changing now. Like for instance, with the young tennis players, if the journalists are asking them aggressive questions or asking them questions in an aggressive way, they say no, we're not going to answer that. So that is changing. So I think the self compassion is and compassion is beginning to be present there. So Stan, one last question,
Yeah.
because this podcast is called "How to Live." So I will ask you exactly this question. So how to live according to Stan Steindl. What do you think is important? An easy question to end our conversation.
Yeah. I think it probably goes back to really what you were mentioning, and by the sounds of it, that one of the things that you're really thinking deeply about, and that is the role of social connection,
Mm,
and I think that's probably how to live.
mm,
The reason, in some ways, that I would feel like that's how to live is because that's how we've always lived.
mm,
The whole evolutionary
mm,
aspect to CFT is I really appreciate that, because there's a lot of even archaeological evidence, ancient
mm,
human remains where this particular person would never have lived as long as they did, given
mm,
the evidence of
mm,
disease, or in the bones or something. Had they not been looked after by someone
mm,
else, had
mm,
someone else not brought them food or water, or things like that. I mean, I think we've always been a species that kind of looks after each other,
mm,
and I mean, we can be a terribly cruel
mm,
species as well, not only to each other but also to other species,
mhm,
and that sort of thing. But we've always been a very social, relational
mm,
species, and I think that's kind of maybe the motto now too.
mm,
How to live well, sort of together, and with
mm,
each other, and looking after each other, and being
mhm,
helpful, and
mhm,
and being open to others
mhm,
helping us, and creating just really a sense of belonging
mhm,
together. I mean, that I sort of paused there because I know there's a lot of people who might say, well, like I'm very isolated. I don't
mhm,
feel like I have anybody. I feel like that's
mm,
hard to imagine that, or scary to
mhm,
imagine doing that, and I really appreciate that, and that can
mm,
be a very valid way to feel,
mm,
especially in today's society. But I suppose that's a theme for me in how to live,
mm,
is that sense of um, relationship and
mm,
togetherness and belonging.
mm. So thank you, Stan. Thank you for an inspiring conversation, and do have a good life. So wishing you and also to our listeners uh, that we all have a good life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Lovely to talk to you.
Likewise.